Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The morning I discovered someone was using my credentials to kill people started like any other Tuesday at the clinic. I'd been practicing psychiatry for 8 years in downtown Portland, mostly treating anxiety and depression cases at a medium-sized mental health facility that served about 300 patients. My routine was predictable: coffee at 6:30, patient files review until 8, then back-to-back appointments until lunch. I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from work, spent weekends hiking when the weather cooperated, and generally kept to myself except for the occasional dinner with colleagues. That particular October day, the leaves were just starting to turn, and I remember thinking how peaceful everything seemed as I walked through the parking lot, completely unaware that my entire career was about to implode. The first sign of trouble came when Bethany, our head pharmacist, called my office around 9:15. She never called unless there was an issue with a prescription, usually just a dosage clarification or an insurance problem. But her voice had this strange edge to it, like she was trying to stay professional while something was clearly wrong. "Dr. Hawthorne," she said, using my full title, which she never did. "I need to verify this haloperidol order for Gregory Paulson. The system shows you authorized 40 milligrams daily, but that seems unusually high." My coffee mug stopped halfway to my lips. Gregory was my patient, yes, but I had him on 5 milligrams, carefully monitored. 40 milligrams wasn't just high, it was dangerous, potentially fatal for someone his age with his medical history. I told Bethany there had to be a mistake, that I'd never authorized that dosage. But she insisted the order came through my secure login at 11:43 the previous night. I rushed down to the pharmacy, my sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floors that always smelled faintly of disinfectant and floor wax. Bethany pulled up the order on her monitor. There it was, my electronic signature, my unique physician ID, timestamp showing 11:43 p.m. But I'd been home by then, already in bed watching some mindless reality show about people renovating houses. I remembered specifically because my neighbor's dog wouldn't stop barking, and I'd turned up the volume to drown it out. Bethany showed me 3 more orders from the past week, all submitted late at night, all with dosages that made no clinical sense. A 17-year-old girl named Kayla, with an order for 80 milligrams of Adderall daily, when the therapeutic maximum was 40. An elderly man prescribed enough Xanax to sedate a horse. Each order looked legitimate in the system, traced back to my login, my digital fingerprint all over them. The IT department got involved around noon. A guy named Jorge, who always wore these vintage band t-shirts under his required polo shirt. He ran diagnostic after diagnostic while I sat there watching, canceling my afternoon appointments, feeling like I was trapped in some kind of administrative nightmare. Jorge kept muttering things about no breach detected and authenticated access points, technical jargon that basically meant whoever was doing this had my actual login credentials. He asked if I'd shared my password with anyone. Absolutely not. Had I logged in from any unusual locations? Never. Did I write my password down anywhere? Of course not. What kind of amateur did he think I was? But the evidence was undeniable. According to their systems, I had been logging in almost every night around 11 or midnight, systematically entering prescription orders for patients across our entire network, not just the ones I personally treated. Things went from bad to catastrophic around 3 that afternoon, when Dr. Reeves, our chief medical officer, called me into his office. His space always felt too cold, like he kept the AC cranked to Arctic levels even in October, and he had this habit of clicking his pen repeatedly when he was stressed. Click, click, click. The sound filled the room as he pulled up report after report on his computer screen. "Judith," he said, and the fact he used my first name made my chest tighten. "We've had 2 patients admitted to Providence emergency room since yesterday. Both overdoses. Both traced back to prescriptions authorized through your account." He turned his monitor toward me. A 19-year-old named Brandon, admitted with respiratory depression from a fentanyl patch prescription I supposedly wrote. The kid didn't even have chronic pain in his medical history. The second was a middle-aged woman, Margaret something, who'd taken the prescribed dose of lithium that was 3 times the therapeutic level and was now in the ICU with kidney failure. I tried to explain, words tumbling out about how someone must have stolen my credentials, how I would never prescribe fentanyl to a teenager, how the lithium dosing was something a first-year resident would know was wrong. But Dr. Reeves just kept clicking that pen, his expression getting more grave with each word I spoke. He pulled up more records, 17 suspicious prescriptions in the last 10 days alone, all following a pattern. High doses of controlled substances, antipsychotics at dangerous levels, mood stabilizers that could cause organ failure if not monitored properly. What scared me most was how calculated it all seemed. Whoever was doing this understood psychopharmacology, knew exactly which drugs at which doses would cause maximum harm, while still appearing plausible enough to pass through the pharmacy's initial safety checks. They weren't just randomly entering numbers. They were deliberately crafting prescriptions designed to hurt people while maintaining enough medical logic to avoid immediate red flags. The police arrived at 4:30, 2 detectives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The woman, Detective Nguyen, had these sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything, while her partner, a younger guy named Hoffman, took notes on a tablet that kept making this annoying chirping sound every time he saved something. They asked me to walk through my routine, my schedule, who had access to my office, whether I'd noticed anyone following me or acting suspicious. The questions felt surreal, like I was suddenly a suspect in my own life. Detective Nguyen asked to see my phone, my laptop, even wanted to know what kind of router I used at home. She explained that sometimes hackers could intercept login credentials through compromised Wi-Fi networks, but when they checked, my home network was secure, properly encrypted. No signs of intrusion. The more they investigated, the more it looked like I was either lying or losing my mind. By 6 o'clock, the hospital had suspended my prescribing privileges pending investigation. The phrase hit me like ice water. Pending investigation. Bureaucratic speak for, "You're done until we figure out if you're a criminal or just incompetent." I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, just staring at the concrete wall in front of me, trying to process how my entire professional life had unraveled in less than 9 hours. My phone buzzed with text after text from colleagues who'd heard through the hospital grapevine. Some offered support, others just wanted gossip, and a few seemed to be distancing themselves already, their messages formal and carefully worded like they were already thinking about potential subpoenas. The worst part was knowing that while I sat there feeling sorry for myself, whoever was doing this still had my credentials, still had access, and was probably preparing to submit more prescriptions that night. I drove home in a daze, nearly missing my exit twice, my mind racing through every interaction I'd had in the past month. The medical resident who'd seemed too interested in my prescribing patterns during rounds, the janitor who always worked late near my office, a quiet man named Carl who wore thick glasses and hummed old jazz tunes, the new pharmacy tech, Ashley, who'd started 3 weeks ago and always seemed to be working the night shift when these prescriptions came through. Even my own patients crossed my mind. Had someone been watching me enter my password during a session? The paranoia was eating at me. When I got to my apartment, I found myself checking the locks twice, pulling the blinds closed, even putting a chair against the door like some character in a thriller movie. I opened my laptop and started documenting everything I could remember about the past 2 weeks, creating a timeline of when I'd been in the office, when I'd left, any unusual encounters or observations. Around 8 o'clock, I got a call from Bethany at the pharmacy. Her voice was different now, urgent and hushed like she was calling from somewhere she shouldn't be. "Judith, I shouldn't be telling you this, but I've been going through the prescription patterns, and there's something weird you need to know." She explained that she'd cross-referenced the fraudulent prescriptions with the pharmacy pickup records. Every single one of these dangerous prescriptions had been picked up, but here's the disturbing part. They were all collected by different people, none of whom matched the patient names. The signatures on the pickup forms were all different, but Bethany had noticed something the police missed. Each signature, while appearing different at first glance, had the same unusual characteristic: a tiny hook at the end of the last letter, barely visible unless you were looking for it. She'd gone back through 3 months of records on her own time and found that same hook appearing on prescriptions for other doctors too, but those had been for normal doses, nothing suspicious enough to flag. The revelation made me physically ill. This wasn't about me at all. I was just the latest target in something bigger. I called Detective Nguyen immediately, but she didn't answer. Left a voicemail trying to explain what Bethany had found, probably sounding like a conspiracy theorist. But then Bethany sent me photos she'd taken of the signature cards, and when I laid them out on my kitchen table, the pattern was undeniable. The hook was there in every single one, hidden in what looked like natural variation in handwriting. I started thinking about who would have access to multiple doctors' credentials, who could pick up prescriptions without raising suspicion, who understood the system well enough to exploit it. That's when it hit me: the medical courier service. We'd switched to a new company about 4 months ago, Secure Health Logistics, and they had employees who regularly accessed multiple floors, multiple departments, handled prescription deliveries and pickups for patients who couldn't come in person. I spent the next 2 hours in a manic research spiral, pulling up everything I could find about Secure Health Logistics. The company website was professional but sparse, incorporated just 6 months ago. No real employee information beyond stock photos. Their Better Business Bureau page had no reviews, which seemed impossible for a medical courier service operating for half a year. The address listed was a mailbox at a UPS store. I called the after-hours line for our hospital's administrative office and convinced the security guard to check who had authorized the contract with Secure Health. The answer chilled me. It had been pushed through by Dr. Nathan Garrett from Psychiatric Services, a colleague who'd mysteriously taken a family emergency leave 2 weeks ago, right when the suspicious prescriptions started escalating. Nathan, who always stayed late, who had administrative access to the prescription system for quality assurance reviews, who'd been so helpful in showing new doctors how to navigate the electronic medical records system. Detective Nguyen called me back at 10:40, and this time she was taking me seriously. She'd had her team pull surveillance footage from the pharmacy's external cameras for the pickup times of the fraudulent prescriptions. The different people picking up the medications? They all wore Secure Health Logistics uniforms, baseball caps pulled low, surgical masks citing health protocols, but they had similar builds, similar gaits. She thought it might be the same 2 or 3 people alternating. Within an hour, they had units heading to Nathan's listed address in the UPS store. But Nathan was gone. His apartment had been cleaned out, rent paid through the month. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him in over a week. The Secure Health Logistics mailbox had been abandoned, stuffed with junk mail. By midnight, they discovered the real scope of the operation. Nathan had been collecting physician credentials for months, using his administrative access during system updates and training sessions. He'd installed keystroke loggers on certain office computers, created fake courier service employees with valid-looking IDs, and built an entire pipeline for acquiring and selling controlled substances. The DEA got involved the next morning, and within 48 hours they'd tracked down Nathan at a motel near the Canadian border with 2 accomplices, former pharmacy technicians who'd been fired from different hospitals over the past year. They had over $300,000 worth of prescription medications in their vehicle, detailed records of physicians' credentials from 4 different hospitals, and plans to expand to 3 more cities. The accomplices cracked quickly, admitting Nathan had recruited them with promises of easy money, claiming the doses they were authorizing were close enough to real prescriptions that no one would get seriously hurt, just enough variation to make profit while flying under the radar. Except Nathan had gotten greedy, started pushing higher doses to increase street value, and that's when patients began showing up in emergency rooms. My prescribing privileges were restored within a week, but I changed my passwords to 30-character randomized strings, enabled every form of 2-factor authentication available, and still checked the prescription logs obsessively every night before bed. Nathan got 15 years federal time. His accomplices got 8 each, and Secure Health Logistics was revealed to be nothing more than a website and some fake uniforms he'd ordered online. Sometimes the most terrifying threats aren't strangers in dark alleys. They're the colleagues who smile at you in the hallway while systematically destroying your life for profit. I've worked the night shift at Riverside Memorial for about 8 years now, and you get used to the weird stuff that happens after midnight. The January of 2018 was particularly rough. We were understaffed, the heating system kept breaking down, and I was pulling doubles just to keep the bills paid. My wife Laura was pregnant with our second kid, and every extra shift meant more money for the baby's room. I was an orderly on the 4th floor, the long-term care ward, where most patients stayed for months or even years. The job wasn't glamorous, changing bedpans, helping nurses move patients, cleaning up whatever needed cleaning, but it was steady work, and the night differential made it worth it. That particular Thursday started like any other shift at 11 p.m., me walking through those fluorescent-lit hallways with my squeaky cart, checking on supplies and making sure everything was stocked for the morning crew. Around 2 a.m., I was restocking gauze in the supply closet when I heard it. The distinct electronic chime of a call bell from down the hall. Nothing unusual about that, except it came from room 4B, which had been empty since old Mr. Jameson passed away 3 months earlier. The room was closed for renovation, supposedly getting new flooring and a paint job, though nobody had started work on it yet. I figured maybe someone had moved a patient there without updating the board. Happens sometimes during busy nights, so I walked down to check. The hallway felt colder than usual, that kind of January cold that seeps through old hospital windows. When I got to 4B, the door was slightly open, just a crack really, and I could see darkness inside. I pushed it open and flicked on the lights. Completely empty, just like it should have been. The bed frame was there without a mattress, some plastic sheeting on the floor, and that old call button still connected to the wall, its red light blinking like it had just been pressed. I disconnected the call button from the wall panel, thinking maybe it was shorting out or something. The thing was ancient, one of those beige plastic models from the early 90s, with a thick coiled cord that reminded me of old telephone handsets. I made a mental note to tell maintenance about it in the morning, and went back to my rounds. About 20 minutes later, I was helping Nurse Diane turn Mrs. Kowalski in room 4F when we heard that same chime again. Diane looked at me funny because she knew 4B was empty too. We both pretended not to notice, but I could tell it bothered her. After we finished with Mrs. Kowalski, I went back to 4B. The call button was still unplugged, lying on the floor exactly where I'd left it, but the red indicator light on the wall panel was going crazy, flashing on and off like Morse code. The weird part was the sound. It wasn't coming from the panel itself, but from the main desk down the hall, like someone was actively pressing a connected button somewhere. That's when things got genuinely strange. While I stood there staring at that flashing light, trying to figure out what kind of electrical problem could cause this, I heard Diane shouting from down the hall. Mr. Thompson in room 4H was having some kind of episode. His breathing had gotten ragged and his monitors were going off. I ran over to help, and we worked on him for maybe 10 minutes before Dr. Patel arrived and stabilized him. The man pulled through, barely, but Diane mentioned something that made my skin prickle. She said, "Mr. Thompson's monitor alarm had started exactly 3 minutes after we heard that call bell from 4B. I laughed it off, told her she was being superstitious, but I went back and checked the desk log. The call from 4B was recorded at 2:27 a.m. Mr. Thompson's cardiac event started at 2:30 a.m. 3 minutes exactly. I tried to put it out of my mind for the rest of the shift, but around 5 a.m. it happened again. This time I was alone at the nurses' station, filling out inventory forms while most of the staff grabbed coffee downstairs. That familiar chime echoed through the empty hallway, and when I looked at the board, there it was. Room 4B lit up like a Christmas tree. I didn't even bother going to check the room this time. Instead, I watched the clock and waited. At 5:03 a.m., exactly 3 minutes later, the emergency buzzer went off in room 4C. Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, 92 years old, had just stopped breathing. We couldn't bring her back. She'd been stable for weeks, no indication anything was wrong. Her daughter had visited just the day before, bringing those sugar-free cookies Mrs. Briggs loved to share with the staff. The attending physician marked it as natural causes. Her heart just gave out, but I knew the timing. That call bell had announced it like some kind of twisted alarm clock. The next morning, I caught Eddie from maintenance in the break room. Eddie's this older Polish guy who's been at Riverside since the place opened in 1987, knows every pipe and wire in the building. I told him about the call bell situation in 4B, keeping the death stuff to myself. Just mentioned it was malfunctioning and disturbing the night routine. He grabbed his toolbox and we went up together. Eddie spent a good hour in there, checking connections, testing the wiring with some voltage meter thing, even traced the lines back to the main panel. "Nothing wrong here," he said, wiping his forehead with a gray handkerchief. "This button's been disconnected from the system since November when Jameson died. See?" He showed me where the wire had been capped off behind the wall panel. Impossible for it to send any signal. Your desk must be picking up interference from somewhere else. But we both knew that wasn't true. The system showed 4B specifically, not some random interference. Word spreads fast in hospitals, especially on the night shift when there's less management around to shut down gossip. By my next shift on Saturday, everyone knew about the 4B situation. Diane had started keeping her own log, and she showed me her notebook. 7 instances in the past 2 weeks where the call bell from 4B had gone off during night shifts. Each time, within 3 to 4 minutes, someone on the ward would have a crisis. Not always fatal, but always serious. The younger nurses thought it was fascinating, some kind of medical mystery to solve. But the older staff, the ones who'd been there long enough to see patterns in the chaos, they started taking different routes to avoid passing 4B after midnight. Even Dr. Patel, who usually scoffed at anything remotely superstitious, admitted he'd rather have the empty room's door kept closed and suggested we tape over the call button panel at the desk. That Saturday night shift turned into something I'll never forget. Around 1 a.m., I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something different about 4B. The door was wide open, not cracked like before, but completely open, propped against the doorstop. I knew I'd closed it at the start of my shift, even checked the handle twice to make sure it latched. The hallway lights created this rectangle of yellow light that stretched into the dark room, and right in the center of that light, on the floor, was the old call button. Not where Eddie and I had left it on the windowsill, but placed deliberately in the middle of the room like someone wanted it to be found. The cord was coiled in a perfect spiral, the kind of precise arrangement that takes time and patience. I stood in that doorway for probably a full minute, trying to rationalize how it got there. Maybe day shift had been in. Maybe someone from housekeeping was preparing the room for renovation. But the dust on the floor told a different story. There was only one set of footprints in that dust, and they were mine from earlier that week. I picked up the call button, and that's when I noticed something I'd missed before. On the back, scratched into the plastic like someone had used a paper clip or a pin, were tiny numbers, 11/14/87, a date. I pulled out my phone and Googled Riverside Memorial, November 14th, 1987, right there in the hallway. The first result made me sit down on the floor. November 14th, 1987, the day Riverside Memorial officially opened. But there was more. A small news article from the local paper mentioned that the hospital's opening had been delayed by 6 hours due to what they called technical difficulties with the emergency alert system. The article didn't elaborate, but there was a quote from the hospital administrator saying they'd resolved an unfortunate calibration error in the patient call system. I was still reading when the call bell chimed. Not from the button in my hand. That was still disconnected. The sound came from the nurse's station, clear and insistent. I checked my phone. 1:47 a.m. At 1:50 a.m., the emergency alarm went off in room 4G. Mr. Walter Cross, admitted just 2 days ago for routine gallbladder surgery, suddenly went into cardiac arrest. This time, we couldn't save him. While the crash team worked on Mr. Cross, I found myself standing in the hallway, holding that disconnected call button, watching the chaos unfold. Diane was crying. Mr. Cross was supposed to go home Monday to see his new granddaughter. The attending physician was baffled, kept saying the surgery had gone perfectly, there was no reason for complications. But I knew there was a reason, even if I couldn't explain it. After they called time of death and the hallway cleared, I went back to 4B one more time. The room felt different now, heavier somehow, like the air itself was pressing down. I placed the call button on the bed frame and said out loud, to no one in particular, "Enough. Whatever this is, enough." It sounds crazy, but I swear the temperature in that room dropped about 10 degrees when I said it. And somewhere in the walls, I heard this faint clicking sound, like an old relay switch trying to connect. The rest of that shift passed without incident. No more call bells from 4B, no more emergencies. When morning came, I made a decision. I went straight to the administrator's office and requested a transfer to the second floor, pediatric ward. Less pay, but I couldn't handle another night waiting for that bell to predict someone's death. Before I left, I stopped by the hospital's records room in the basement. The old maintenance logs from 1987 were stored in these yellowing binders that smelled like mildew and old paper. It took me an hour, but I found it. November 14, 1987, an incident report filed by the head of maintenance. The new call bell system had been installed incorrectly, with some kind of feedback loop that caused random alerts. But here's the disturbing part. During those 6 hours of delay, before they fixed the system, 3 patients died on the 4th floor. The report noted it as coincidence, but mentioned that staff had complained the call bells seemed to activate in advance of medical emergencies. The hospital's solution? They replaced the entire system within a month except, and this was handwritten in the margin, Unit 4B panel retained due to budget constraints. It's been 5 years since I transferred floors. I still work nights at Riverside, but I never go up to the 4th floor anymore. Sometimes I run into Diane in the cafeteria, and she tells me things. The call bell in 4B still goes off. They've renovated the room twice, replaced the entire panel, even had an electrician rewire that whole section of the building. Nothing stops it. The hospital administration officially lists it as a non-critical electrical anomaly, but the night staff knows better. They keep the room locked now, permanently marked as under maintenance. New nurses sometimes ask why, and the older ones just tell them not to worry about it. But here's what really haunts me. Diane showed me her notebook last month. She's been tracking it for 5 years. The pattern never changed. 3 minutes before someone on that floor enters critical condition, room 4B announces it. Every single time. The hospital has the lowest mortality rate in the state for the 4th floor now, because the night staff has learned to stage outside patient rooms when that bell rings, ready to respond. They've saved dozens of lives this way. So maybe that's why it keeps happening. Maybe it was never about death at all. Maybe something in that room, in those old wires and forgotten circuits, is trying to help. I don't know, and honestly, I don't want to know. I just know I'll never work that floor again. I need to get this out there because I genuinely don't know who else to turn to at this point. I'm a psychiatric nurse at a state facility in northern Michigan. Been doing this for about 8 years now. Last month was when everything started going sideways. And I mean completely sideways in ways that still make my head spin when I think about it. I was working the evening shift like I always did, 4 to midnight, handling the West Wing where we kept our long-term residents. The facility itself is one of those old brick buildings from the 60s. You know the type. Long hallways that echo, fluorescent lights that hum just loud enough to notice, and that distinct smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with cafeteria food that never quite leaves your clothes. I'd just come back from a week off visiting my sister in Florida, feeling refreshed and ready to dive back into the routine. That Monday evening started like any other. Medication rounds, checking in with patients, updating charts on the computer system we'd switched to just 2 years prior. Around 7 that night, I was at the nurse's station finishing up some documentation when Dr. Henley came by with a stack of manila folders. He dropped them on the counter with this exhausted look on his face and said something about needing to review my recent assessments before the state inspection next week. Now here's the thing. I'm meticulous about my charting, always have been since nursing school, so I wasn't worried about any review. But when I opened the first folder, for a patient named Ronald Vance, who'd been with us for 3 years, I saw pages and pages of handwritten notes that looked exactly like my writing. I mean exactly. Same way I loop my G's, same way I make those little dots over my I's instead of circles, even that weird way I write the number 8 that my husband always teases me about. But these notes were describing incidents I'd never seen. Ronald apparently attacking another patient with a food tray, screaming about cameras in his teeth, trying to dig something out of his arm with a plastic spoon. The dates on these reports were from the week I was in Florida, every single one of them. I sat there staring at those papers for what must have been 5 minutes, just trying to process what I was seeing. The details in the notes were incredibly specific. Things like patient became agitated at 3:47 p.m. when overhead announcement interrupted his counting ritual, or required 4-point restraints after attempting to bite nursing assistant Jennifer during evening medications. Jennifer was new, started just before I left for vacation, and when I'd asked her earlier how her first week alone went, she'd said everything was smooth, no incidents at all. I flipped to the next folder. Catherine Moss, sweet lady in her 70s who mostly kept to herself doing crossword puzzles. According to these notes in my handwriting, she'd been found hoarding sharp objects under her mattress, fashioning them into what I'd apparently described as makeshift weapons. The writing even included my personal shorthand, little abbreviations I'd developed over the years that nobody else used, like PT with a little underline for patient, or my specific way of noting medication times with military hours followed by a dash. Dr. Henley came back around 8:30. Asking if I'd finished reviewing everything for the inspection prep. I told him there had to be some mistake, that I wasn't even here those dates, but he just gave me this confused look and pulled out his phone. He showed me the schedule. There was my name, clear as day, marked as working every single shift that week. Even showed me the timesheet approvals with my electronic signature. I tried explaining about Florida, about my sister's birthday, but he started getting this concerned expression, the one doctors get when they think a staff member might be having some kind of breakdown. He suggested maybe I was confusing the dates, that stress can do funny things to memory, and perhaps I should review the security footage if I had concerns. The way he said it, though, carefully, like he was talking to one of the patients, made something cold settle in my chest. The next morning I came in early, around 6 a.m., determined to check those security recordings myself. The security office was in the basement, this cramped little room that always smelled like burnt coffee and cigarettes, even though nobody was supposed to smoke in there anymore. Paul, the security guard who'd been there since the place opened, was just finishing his night shift. I asked him to pull up the footage from the previous week, specifically Monday the 12th at around 4 p.m., when I supposedly started my shift. Paul typed away at his ancient computer, pulled up the footage, and there I was. Or at least, someone who looked exactly like me. Same scrubs I always wore. Same way of pulling my hair back with that specific twist I do, even wearing the watch my daughter gave me for Christmas. This person on the screen walked with my exact gait, that slight favor to my left knee from an old skiing injury. I watched myself badge in, grab a coffee from the break room, 2 sugars, no cream, just like always, and head to the West Wing to start rounds. I had Paul replay it 3 times, zooming in on the face each time. It was me, but it couldn't be me because I have photos on my phone from that exact day showing me and my sister at a seafood restaurant in Clearwater, Florida, timestamp and location data included. When I showed Paul the photos, he just shrugged and said maybe it was a technical glitch with my phone, that sometimes these things happen with digital stuff. But then, I asked him to show me something specific. Footage from the medication room at 9 p.m. that same night. See, I have this particular way of organizing the med cart, always putting the controlled substances on the left side, regular meds on the right, with labels facing out. Sure enough, there was me doing exactly that. Even doing that thing where I tap each bottle twice before placing it, a habit I picked up from my mentor years ago. Paul started looking uncomfortable, kept glancing at me like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of test or if I was having an episode. That afternoon, I decided to talk to some of the patients directly, starting with Ronald Vance. Ronald had been relatively stable for months before I left, responding well to his medication regimen, participating in group therapy. When I found him in the day room working on a jigsaw puzzle, I sat down casually and asked how his week had been. He looked up at me with these wide, frightened eyes and immediately scooted his chair back. "You're different today," he whispered, glancing around like someone might be listening. "You're the real one, aren't you? The other one, she had your face, but her eyes were wrong. They were too steady, never blinked enough. She kept asking about my dreams, writing everything down, wanted to know about the voices in detail." My breath caught because I never discuss auditory hallucinations in detail with Ronald. It tends to agitate him. He leaned in closer and said the other me had given him new pills, white ones instead of his usual blue ones, and they made him feel like his thoughts were being pulled out through his fingernails. I checked his med chart immediately. There was an order for a medication change signed by Dr. Henley, based on nursing recommendations from my reports. Catherine Moss was next, and finding her was harder than usual. She was in her room, had pushed her bed against the door, and only opened it a crack when I knocked. The moment she saw me, she started crying, these deep, shuddering sobs that shook her whole frame. "I knew you'd come back," she kept saying, clutching my hand through the small opening she'd allowed. "The other one, she pretended to be you, but she smelled wrong, like copper pennies and something chemical." She kept asking about my son, the one who died in Iraq, wanted to know if I ever felt him watching me. This made me go rigid because Catherine didn't have a son who died in Iraq. She had a daughter who lived in Phoenix and visited monthly. But when I gently corrected her, she looked at me with such conviction and said, "That's what I told her too, but she said I was confused, that the trauma made me change the memory. She made me take extra medicine, said it would help me remember correctly." I checked Catherine's chart on my tablet. There were pages of notes about delusional memory replacement and grief-induced psychosis that recommended increased antipsychotic dosages, all in my handwriting, all signed with my identification number. By evening, I was desperate for answers and decided to confront Jennifer, the new nursing assistant, more directly. I found her in the supply room doing inventory, and when I walked in, she physically jumped, dropping a box of latex gloves that scattered across the floor. As we picked them up together, I asked her point blank about the incident with Catherine, about the supposed bite attempt during medications. Jennifer went pale, literally white like paper, and started stammering. "You told me never to mention it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You said it would compromise the study, that I'd lose my job if anyone found out about the protocols." "Study? What study?" I pressed her for details and she pulled out her phone, showing me text messages from my number, sent during that week I was supposedly in Florida. The messages were detailed instructions about observing specific patients, noting their reactions to environmental stimuli, and keeping everything off the official records. One message even said, "Remember, Jennifer, this is about understanding the elasticity of memory under stress. The board approved this months ago, but we can't have the patients knowing they're being observed differently." I grabbed Jennifer's phone to look closer at those messages, and that's when I noticed something that made my whole body go numb. The texts had my phone number, yes, but there were tiny inconsistencies in the language. Phrases I'd never use, like "pursuant to our discussion" or as per the implemented parameters. I scrolled up further and found a message that said, "Make sure you're present when I conduct the afternoon assessments. Watch how I maintain exact mimicry of standard behavioral patterns." Jennifer was shaking now, telling me she thought it was some kind of special training program, that I'd told her it was a new approach to psychiatric care, where nurses would test the boundaries of patient perception. She said the other me had given her a thick manual about therapeutic personality modulation and made her sign a confidentiality agreement. When I asked to see this manual, she said the other me had collected all copies last Friday, said the Phase 1 documentation period was complete. The more Jennifer talked, the more I realized whoever had been here wasn't just pretending to be me. They were using my position, my reputation, my entire professional identity to conduct some kind of experiment on vulnerable patients. That night, I didn't go home. Instead, I stayed in my car in the parking lot, watching the building, trying to make sense of everything. Around 11 p.m., I saw something that still makes me sick to think about. A figure emerged from the employee entrance, someone wearing my exact scrubs, walking with my gait, even carrying the same tote bag I always used with that stupid coffee stain on the bottom corner. But here's the thing. I was sitting in my car, watching this person who looked exactly like me walk to a vehicle 3 rows over. It was a silver sedan, unremarkable except for the government plates. I followed at a distance as the car drove not toward my neighborhood, but to an office complex on the other side of town, one of those anonymous glass buildings that could house anything. The figure badged into the building using what looked like a federal ID, disappearing into an elevator. I sat there until dawn, watching, but they never came back out. When I finally drove home, I found something that confirmed my worst fears. My mailbox had a thick envelope with no return address, just my name typed on a label. Inside were photographs of me at the facility during the week I was in Florida, detailed behavioral notes about my performance metrics, and a single typed page that said, Phase 1, Identity Integration Complete. Subject demonstrated 97% accuracy in behavioral replication. Patients showed expected stress responses to duplicity stimuli. Recommend progression to Phase 2 pending review. The next day, I went straight to the state board, brought all my evidence, the photos from Florida, the security footage timestamps, the patient's testimonies I'd recorded on my phone, everything. The investigator, a stern woman named Dolores Finch, listened to everything with this increasingly troubled expression. She made calls, pulled records, even sent someone to the facility immediately. But when they reviewed the employee files, there was no record of me ever taking vacation that week. My sister's number in my emergency contacts? It had been changed to a number that, when called, went to a voicemail saying the number was designated for research verification purposes only. The investigation concluded that I had suffered what they called a stress-induced dissociative episode, recommended I take immediate medical leave, and suggested psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Henley supported this recommendation, citing the concerning delusions I'd been experiencing. But here's what haunts me. The morning I was escorted out of the facility for my own well-being, I passed the nurses' station and saw the schedule for next month. My name was on it, full shifts, already approved. And in the margin, someone had written in my handwriting, Phase 2 initiated. I've been home for 3 weeks now, and yesterday my neighbor mentioned she saw me leaving for work at 4 p.m., wearing my scrubs, looking perfectly normal. I was sitting in my kitchen at that exact moment, staring at my revoked ID badge, wondering if I'm losing my mind or if something far worse is happening. I'd been doing security at Millbrook Psychiatric for about 6 months when everything went sideways. The job was perfect for me at the time. Graveyard shift, minimal interaction with people, just me and the monitors in the basement control room. I was 34, recently divorced, and needed something steady while I figured out what came next with my life. The facility itself was one of those old state hospitals from the 50s, all brick and narrow windows, converted into a modern treatment center, but still carrying that institutional weight in its bones. Most nights, I'd sit there watching empty hallways, checking door alarms, doing my rounds every 2 hours like clockwork. The place had this specific smell, industrial disinfectant mixed with something medicinal that clung to your clothes even after you went home. It was a Wednesday night in early December when I first heard the voices. I was doing my usual monitor sweep, clicking through the different camera feeds, the main entrance, the 3 residential wings, the therapy rooms, the cafeteria. The therapy wing was always dark at night, just emergency lighting casting these long shadows down the corridor. I had just switched to camera 12, which covered the old group therapy room, when I heard it. Clear as day through my headset, a man's voice, calm and measured, asking someone about their childhood. Then another voice responding, female, talking about her mother's drinking problem. The audio quality was pristine, like they were sitting right next to me. I checked the screen again. The room was completely empty, just overturned chairs and that ugly green carpet they never replaced after the last renovation. At first, I figured it was interference from somewhere else in the building. Maybe maintenance had left a radio on, or someone's phone was picking up a podcast through the system. I pulled up the audio panel on my computer and started checking levels across all the cameras. Nothing on cameras 1 through 11. Camera 12 showed active audio input, the little green bars jumping with each word. I could hear the therapist now asking about medication compliance, his voice having this particular rasp like he'd been smoking for decades. The woman was crying softly, saying she didn't mean to hurt her sister, that the voices had told her to do it. I pulled out my phone and Googled the name she mentioned, Dr. Harrison, a therapist at Millbrook who'd retired 8 years ago. The patient, Gloria something, I couldn't find anything definitive, but the details she gave about her case lined up with a news story from 2015. The thing that really got me was how natural it all sounded. This wasn't some recording playing on a loop. There were pauses, shuffling sounds, the squeak of a chair when someone shifted their weight. I even heard the therapist flip through papers and click his pen a few times. I radioed Jerome, the other guard working the East Wing that night, asking if he was hearing anything weird on his end. He just laughed and said the only thing he heard was his stomach growling because he forgot his dinner. I didn't push it. Jerome was 2 weeks from retirement and had made it clear from day one that he didn't care about anything beyond collecting his last few paychecks. I made a note in the log about potential audio equipment malfunction and tried to ignore it, but the session continued for another 40 minutes, ending with the therapist scheduling a follow-up for the next week. The next 3 nights were quiet. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, maybe dozed off and had one of those super vivid dreams that feel completely real. But that Saturday, around 2 a.m., it happened again. Different camera this time, number 8, monitoring the individual therapy room on the 2nd floor. The voice that came through was younger, a different therapist, talking to what sounded like a teenage boy about his anger issues. The kid was describing how he'd beaten up his stepfather with a baseball bat, how the blood had splattered on his mom's white kitchen curtains. The therapist kept asking him to slow down, to breathe, but the kid was ramped up, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. I found myself leaning forward, completely absorbed in this session that supposedly wasn't happening in a room that was definitely empty. What made me start writing everything down was when the therapist mentioned the date during the session, April 15, 2017. I grabbed a notebook from the desk drawer and started documenting everything. The patient's first name was Kevin, no last name mentioned. The therapist was Dr. Melissa Reeves. I looked her up right away on my phone. She'd worked at Millbrook from 2016 to 2018, then moved to Colorado. Her LinkedIn showed her working at some wellness center in Denver now. The session I was hearing had happened over 7 years ago, but every word came through crystal clear, like it was being broadcast directly into my headset. Kevin was talking about the foster homes, about being moved 8 times before he turned 15, about his real dad who'd disappeared when he was 3, The emotion in his voice was raw, genuine. You couldn't fake that kind of pain. By the third week, I was hearing sessions almost every night. Always through different cameras, always featuring therapists who no longer worked at Millbrook and patients from years past. I'd filled up half my notebook with names, dates, and session details. Some of the patients I could trace through old news articles or obituaries. At least 4 of them had died, either from overdoses or suicide, years after their treatment. I started bringing my laptop to work, creating a spreadsheet to track patterns. The sessions weren't chronological. I'd hear one from 2008, then 2016, then 2011. No apparent connection between the patients either. Different diagnoses, different therapists, different treatment outcomes. The only common thread was that all these sessions had happened in rooms that those specific cameras monitored. Then came that Friday night, December 20th. I'd just finished my first round, checking all the doors and emergency exits, making sure the medication room was properly secured. Settled back into my chair with my gas station coffee, I started the camera rotation. Camera 3 was showing the small therapy office near the admission desk, when I heard a voice that made me spill coffee all over my uniform. It was my voice. Clear. Unmistakable. I was listening to myself talking to a therapist. But here's the thing. I'd never been a patient at Millbrook. Never had therapy anywhere for that matter. I didn't believe in that stuff. Always figured I could handle my own problems. But there I was, hearing myself tell some Dr. Anderson about the car accident, about watching Melanie die while I couldn't get my seatbelt undone, about the months of insomnia that followed. Melanie was my ex-wife's name, but she was very much alive, probably asleep in her apartment across town with her new boyfriend. The version of me in the recording sounded broken, desperate. He was talking about the guilt, about how he should have been driving that night instead of letting her take the wheel after the party. He mentioned specific details. The song playing on the radio when the truck hit them, the smell of antifreeze mixing with blood, the way her hand went limp in his. I sat there paralyzed, listening to myself describe memories I didn't have of events that never happened. Doctor. Anderson's voice was soothing, professional, asking about previous trauma, about my relationship with my father. The other me started talking about finding my dad in the garage when I was 12, about cutting him down from the rafters but being too late. My actual father was alive, living in retirement in Arizona, sending me fishing photos every other week. I must have listened for 20 minutes before I finally snapped out of it and grabbed my phone. Called Melanie right there at 3 a.m. She answered on the 5th ring, groggy and annoyed, demanding to know what emergency justified waking her up. Just hearing her voice, irritated but definitely alive, helped me breathe again. I made up some excuse about thinking I'd left something at her place months ago, apologized for the hour. After hanging up, I immediately called my dad. He didn't answer, it was even earlier in Arizona, but his voicemail greeting was enough. That familiar gruff voice telling me to leave a message. I didn't. Instead, I turned back to the monitor, but the session had ended. Camera 3 showed the empty therapy room, just a leather chair, a desk with a tissue box, and those generic motivational posters about growth and healing. The rest of my shift, I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept replaying what I'd heard, trying to make sense of it. Around 5 a.m., I made a decision. When the day shift arrived at 6 instead of heading home, I went straight to the administrative offices on the 3rd floor. Found Cheryl, the HR manager, just getting in with her Starbucks and morning bagel. Told her I needed to check something in my employment file. Made up a story about needing documentation for a loan application. She was hesitant at first, but I'd been a reliable employee with no issues, so she pulled up my file on her computer. That's when everything shifted. There, in my records, was a patient intake form from 2022. Not employment records, patient records. A 3-day involuntary hold following what the form described as a psychotic episode related to unprocessed trauma. The admission notes mentioned severe dissociation, auditory hallucinations, and complete amnesia regarding traumatic events. Cheryl was looking at me strangely now, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. She asked if I was feeling all right, mentioned that she knew returning to work here after being a patient could be challenging, but that the hospital believed in recovery and second chances. I just stared at her, my mind racing. According to these records, I'd been admitted after being found by police, walking down the highway at night, claiming I needed to save Melanie from the accident. The records showed treatment notes, medication logs, even discharge paperwork signed with my signature. But I remembered none of it. My memory of 2022 was clear. I'd been working at a warehouse that year, living in a different apartment, going through the divorce proceedings. I asked Cheryl to print everything, told her I needed copies for my therapist. She did, though her expression suggested she was considering calling someone, maybe security, which was ironic since I was security. I left the building with a stack of papers that documented a life I didn't remember living. The morning sun felt too bright, unreal almost. I sat in my car in the parking lot for an hour, reading through every page. The clinical notes were detailed. Apparently, I'd been convinced that multiple versions of my life were bleeding together, that I could hear echoes of alternate timelines through electronic devices. Dr. Anderson, the same therapist from the recording, had treated me. His notes described my condition as a rare form of dissociative disorder, possibly triggered by extreme stress. The discharge summary indicated improvement with antipsychotic medication and recommended outpatient therapy, which, according to the records, I'd attended for 6 months. There were even progress notes from those sessions, describing my gradual acceptance of the real timeline and decreased reports of auditory phenomena. I called in sick for the next 3 nights, spent the time trying to verify which memories were real. Called old coworkers from the warehouse. They remembered me but were fuzzy on the exact dates I'd worked there. Checked my bank records from 2022. There was a 3-day gap in transactions that matched the hospitalization dates, and several payments to a pharmacy after that for medications I didn't remember taking. The pills were still in my medicine cabinet when I looked, the bottles dusty and unopened, prescribed by Dr. Anderson for acute psychosis. I stared at them, trying to remember buying them, taking them, anything. Nothing came back. But what really disturbed me was finding a journal in my closet, shoved behind old tax returns. My handwriting, pages and pages describing the voices I was hearing through TVs, radios, phones, all talking about tragedies that hadn't happened yet or had happened differently. The last entry was dated a week before I'd apparently applied for the security job at Millbrook. I went back to work after those 3 days. Couldn't afford to lose the job, and honestly, I needed answers. The first night back, I didn't hear anything unusual. Just the normal sounds of the hospital at night, the hum of fluorescent lights, distant footsteps from the medical wing, the occasional beep from the door sensors. I started to think maybe it was over, that discovering the truth had somehow broken whatever was happening. But around 4 a.m., while monitoring camera 15 in the East Wing therapy room, I heard my voice again. This time I was talking to Dr. Anderson about the sessions I'd been hearing through the security monitors. The me in the recording was describing exactly what I'd experienced over the past few weeks, hearing the old therapy sessions, discovering I'd been a patient, finding the journal. Dr. Anderson was asking if I'd been taking my medication. The other me laughed, said he'd started taking them again after finding the bottles, said the voices had stopped once he did. The session was dated December 23rd, 3 days from now. I quit that night. Didn't even finish my shift, just packed up my thermos, left my badge on the desk, and walked out. On my way home, I stopped at a 24-hour diner and threw the printed records in their dumpster. Back at my apartment, I flushed all the pills down the toilet, threw the journal in the garbage chute. Found a new job within a week. Overnight stocking at a grocery store, no monitors, no recordings, just boxes and shelves. It's been 8 months now. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice, if I should have kept listening to find out what happens next, or if I should have taken those pills to see if they really would have made it stop. But mostly I try not to think about it at all. The only thing that still bothers me is this. Last week I was organizing my closet and found another journal, newer than the first one, hidden in a shoebox. The first entry is dated December 23rd, in my handwriting, describing my first day back at Millbrook after taking medical leave. According to this journal, I never quit. According to this journal, I'm still working there. I'd been supervising the night shift at Westfield General for about 6 months when everything went sideways that Monday, in November 2023. The hospital sprawled across 3 interconnected buildings in downtown Seattle, and after working there since I graduated nursing school, I knew every hallway, every shortcut between wings, every supply closet where exhausted residents would sneak quick naps. My life at that point was pretty routine. Divorced 2 years earlier, living alone in a studio apartment 15 minutes away, picking up extra shifts to keep myself busy and pad my savings account. I actually preferred the night shift because the administrative chaos died down after 9 p.m., leaving just the steady rhythm of patient care, medication rounds, and the occasional emergency that kept things interesting. That particular night started like any other, with me settling into the supervisor's office around 11 p.m., ready to review staffing schedules and tackle the endless pile of transfer paperwork that somehow multiplied every time I turned my back. The first sign of trouble came when I found a stack of patient transfer forms tucked behind the printer, forms I'd never seen before despite handling every piece of paperwork that moved through our department. These weren't our standard yellow transfer sheets, but pale blue documents with Unit 7 West Transfer Authorization, printed across the top in bold letters that seemed to shimmer slightly under the fluorescent lights. What caught my attention wasn't just the unfamiliar format, but the destination listed on each form. Ward 7W, Psychiatric Isolation Unit, a place that didn't exist anywhere in our hospital's layout. I'd memorized every floor plan during my supervisor training, walked every unit during my rounds, and there was no Ward 7W, especially not on the 7th floor, which only had units A through D. The signatures at the bottom looked authentic though, bearing the distinctive scrawls of Dr. Morrison and Dr. Yamamoto, 2 of our most senior psychiatrists, whose handwriting I'd recognize anywhere after years of deciphering their medication orders. I started going through the forms more carefully, and that's when my chest began to tighten with genuine unease. Each form documented a patient transfer that had supposedly occurred within the past 3 weeks, complete with admission times, diagnosis codes, and detailed notes about specialized containment protocols and sensory restriction therapy, terms I'd never encountered in 15 years of psychiatric nursing. The patient names were all there in black ink. Robert Simmons, age 34, transferred for aggressive dissociative episodes. Maria Gonzalez, age 28, moved for reality integration therapy. Douglas Park, age 45, requiring intensive cognitive restructuring. These weren't just random names either. I vaguely remembered admitting a Robert Simmons earlier that month, a soft-spoken accountant who'd checked in for severe anxiety after losing his job. The timestamps on the form showed transfers happening during my shifts, at times when I was definitely in the building, yet I had no memory of authorizing or even seeing these particular movements. My first instinct was to check our electronic medical records system, pulling up each patient's file, while the office hummed with the white noise of ventilation systems and distant monitor beeps. Robert Simmons's chart showed him as an active patient, still supposedly occupying bed 4B in our standard psychiatric unit, with nursing notes entered just that morning describing his continued improvement and positive response to medication. But when I called down to 4B and asked Nurse Stevens to do a visual check, she came back on the line confused, telling me that bed had been empty for at least a week, maybe longer. The strangest part was how she paused before answering, like she was trying to remember something just out of reach, then mentioned that she thought Simmons had been discharged, but couldn't quite recall when or to where. I pulled up Maria Gonzalez next, finding the same pattern: active chart, recent nursing notes, But when I called the unit, the charge nurse insisted that room had been vacant since the previous month's deep cleaning. By 2 in the morning, I'd abandoned my regular duties and started walking the floors myself, those blue transfer forms clutched in my increasingly sweaty grip. The 7th floor should have been my first stop, but the elevator wouldn't go past the 6th floor no matter how many times I pressed the button. The 7 just wouldn't light up, like it had been disconnected from the panel entirely. I took the stairs instead, my footsteps echoing in that narrow concrete stairwell. But when I reached what should have been the 7th floor landing, the door opened directly onto the 8th floor's cardiac unit. I tried 3 different stairwells throughout the building, even the old service stairs that maintenance used. But it was the same everywhere. You could go from 6 to 8, but 7 had somehow been edited out of the building's physical structure. The weird thing was that from outside, you could still see the 7th floor's windows, rows of them glowing with soft yellow light between the 6th and 8th floors. But inside the building, that floor had become architecturally impossible to reach. I decided to track down Dr. Yamamoto, finding him in the emergency department finishing up with a patient who'd come in with severe chest pains. When I showed him the transfer forms with his signature, his face went through this progression of expressions I'll never forget. First confusion, then recognition, then this blank neutrality that didn't reach his eyes. He held the papers up to the light, running his thumb over his own signature like he was testing if the ink was real, and told me yes. He remembered signing them, remembered these patients needed specialized care that our regular units couldn't provide. But when I pressed him for details about Ward 7W, about where exactly these patients had gone, his answers became increasingly vague and contradictory. He mentioned something about a new treatment protocol, a pilot program, then changed his story to say it was a temporary overflow unit, then finally just stared at me with these hollow eyes and said he needed to get back to his rounds. The way he walked away, stiff and mechanical like someone had pulled his strings, made every hair on my arms stand straight up. Around 4 in the morning, my phone started ringing with calls from the main reception desk. Families were showing up demanding to visit their loved ones, the very patients listed on those blue transfer forms. Mrs. Simmons arrived first, a frail woman in her 60s wearing a raincoat despite the clear night, clutching a bag of her son's favorite homemade cookies and insisting she'd received a call telling her Robert was asking for her. She showed me the call log on her phone, a number from inside the hospital at 3:47 a.m., but when I checked our system, no calls had been placed from any unit to outside numbers during that time. Then came Maria Gonzalez's husband with their 2 young children, still in their pajamas, saying Maria had texted him that she needed him there immediately. He showed me the message on his phone, sent from Maria's number just an hour ago. "Please come now. 7th floor, they're moving us again." But Maria's phone was still in the belonging storage, had been there since her admission, the battery dead for days according to the inventory log. The situation spiraled completely out of control when more families kept arriving, each with their own impossible communication from patients who couldn't be located anywhere in our system's physical tracking. I tried calling security, but Officer Daniels just mumbled something about Protocol 77 and hung up on me. And when I went to find him at his desk, he was sitting there staring at his monitors showing empty hallways, typing the same sentence over and over on an incident report. Transfer completed as authorized. The other nurses on duty were becoming increasingly agitated, some insisting they'd just seen these missing patients during their rounds, others swearing the rooms had been empty for weeks, and a few just standing frozen in the hallways with 1,000-yard stares, mechanically going through the motions of checking empty rooms and updating charts for patients who weren't there. I watched Nurse Blackwood cheerfully administer medications to an empty bed, carefully documenting the dose and checking off her tasks while talking to nobody about how much better they were looking today. Desperate for answers, I went back to the administrative wing and started pulling physical files from the archives, the old paper records we kept as backups before everything went digital. In a locked filing cabinet that required 3 different keys to open, I found a folder marked 7W Protocol 1987-2023, filled with hundreds of those same blue transfer forms dating back decades. Each form documented a patient transfer to the non-existent Ward 7W, each signed by doctors who'd worked here over the years, some who'd retired, some who'd died, but all legitimate medical professionals whose signatures matched personnel records. The oldest form was for a patient named William Harper, transferred November 15, 1987, for cognitive reconditioning, and at the bottom, someone had written in pencil, "Family notified of successful discharge, 11/30/87. But attached to it was a newspaper clipping from December 1987 about William Harper's family filing a missing person report, insisting the hospital was hiding something about his disappearance. The breaking point came when I discovered my own handwriting on several recent forms, authorizations I had absolutely no memory of signing. My signature was there, dated and timed during shifts I'd worked, approving transfers for patients I'd never met to a ward that didn't exist. The most recent one was dated just 6 hours ago for a patient named Oliver Reed, and according to the timestamp, I'd signed it while I was eating my lunch in the break room, completely alone. I ran back to check the security footage from the break room, and there I was on the screen, calmly eating my sandwich with one hand while my other hand signed form after form on documents that weren't visible on the camera, my face blank and serene like I was in some kind of trance. Watching myself perform actions I couldn't remember, seeing my own hand authorize these impossible transfers, made me realize that whatever was happening in this hospital had already gotten to me too, had been using me as part of its system without my knowledge. By 6 in the morning, with families still gathering in the lobby demanding answers I couldn't provide, I made the decision to call the state health department and report the entire situation. But when I picked up the phone, my fingers dialed a completely different number, and I heard myself calmly telling someone on the other end that Ward 7W was ready for the next batch before hanging up. I tried again, forcing myself to concentrate on each digit, but my hand kept betraying me, drawing those blue forms from my pocket and filling them out with patient names I was pulling from the active roster. I watched myself write, unable to stop my own hand as I authorized transfers for 3 more patients who were sleeping peacefully in their beds just floors below. The worst part was feeling my face arrange itself into that same serene expression I'd seen on the security footage, even as my mind screamed in panic. I knew I had to get out before I became completely lost to whatever process was consuming the hospital, so I grabbed as many of those blue forms as I could carry and ran for the parking garage. Behind me, I could hear families crying in the lobby, demanding to see loved ones who existed only in paperwork and phone logs, while staff members continued their robotic routines of caring for empty beds and updating charts for the disappeared. In my car, I spread out all the forms I'd taken and noticed something I'd missed before. Each patient's diagnosis included the same phrase buried in different medical terminology: reality displacement disorder, hidden within their supposed conditions. Every single one of them, over decades of transfers, had been marked with the same impossible diagnosis that no medical textbook had ever described. I drove straight to the police station with my evidence, but when I handed over the forms to the desk sergeant, he just looked at them blankly and said they were blank papers, nothing but empty blue sheets without a single word written on them. That was 3 months ago, and I never went back to Westfield General after that night. I submitted my resignation via email, packed up my apartment within a week, and moved to my sister's place in Vermont, where I found work at a small rural clinic that still uses paper charts and has only 2 floors. The state investigation I'd hoped would happen never materialized. When I called to follow up, they had no record of any complaints about Westfield General, no reports of missing patients, nothing unusual in their inspection records. But I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I keep those blue forms locked in a safe deposit box even though everyone else sees them as blank pages. Sometimes I check the hospital's website, looking at staff photos, and I notice familiar faces are missing. Dr. Yamamoto's bio disappeared in December, Nurse Blackwood's in early February, replaced by new doctors and nurses whose smiles seem just a little too fixed, a little too perfect. The families never stopped searching, though, and I still get messages through social media from Mrs. Simmons, from Mr. Gonzalez, from dozens of others whose loved ones vanished into Ward 7W. They tell me the hospital insists their family members were discharged, showing them paperwork with their own signatures approving the releases, signatures they swear they never made. Some families have hired private investigators, but they always come back with the same report. The patients were properly discharged, all documentation is in order. There's nothing unusual to investigate. But every November, around the anniversary of that night, I get a text from a number I don't recognize, always the same message. Ward 7W is ready for the next batch. Please report for your shift. I delete it immediately, change my phone number every year, but the message always finds me. I've accepted that I'll never understand what really happened at Westfield General, what Ward 7W actually was, or where those patients went. All I know is that I got out before I became another signature on a blue form, another person who exists only in paperwork, while their family searches for answers that the hospital will never provide. The night shift at Pinewood Behavioral Center was never anyone's first choice, but after my divorce in 2017, I needed the extra differential pay. I'd been working psych units for almost 15 years by then, mostly in the Midwest, and thought I'd seen everything. Patients who believed they were government experiments, folks convinced their neighbors were poisoning them through the walls, people who swore they could hear colors. You develop a thick skin and learn to separate the illness from the person underneath. That February, though, something happened that still makes me question everything I thought I knew about what's possible and what isn't. I was the charge nurse on Unit 4B, the acute stabilization ward, and we had maybe 12 patients that week. Nothing unusual for winter when the isolation tends to hit people harder. The first incident was on a Monday night, and I remember it clearly because I'd just finished doing medication counts with Bryce, the pharmacy tech, who always brought those terrible gas station energy drinks that smelled like liquid candy. Around 3:20 a.m., I was documenting in the nurse's station when the call light for room 407 started going off. Not the normal steady beep, but that rapid, frantic pressing that meant real distress. The patient was Mrs. Hutchinson, a 62-year-old woman admitted for severe depression after her husband's death. She was sitting bolt upright in bed, her thin hospital gown soaked with sweat, pointing at the corner where I supposedly had been standing just moments before. She kept saying I'd been there, just watching her sleep, my face completely blank, not responding when she asked what I needed. The thing is, I'd been in the medication room doing inventory with Bryce since 3 a.m., and we had the computer logs, the security badge swipes, even Bryce himself to verify it. I tried to calm Mrs. Hutchinson down, gave her some Ativan as prescribed, and chalked it up to a particularly vivid nightmare. Grief does strange things to the mind, and she'd been having trouble sleeping since admission. But she was so specific about the details. She said I was wearing my purple scrubs, the ones with the small coffee stain near the pocket that I'd been meaning to replace, and that my hair was in the same messy bun I always wore on night shifts. She even mentioned that I was holding a clipboard, just standing there in the darkness, not moving, not blinking, just staring at her with this vacant expression. What really got me was when she said my ID badge was turned backwards, something I habitually did when leaning over patients, so the hard plastic wouldn't hit them in the face. These weren't generic details someone would imagine. They were specific observations that made me deeply uncomfortable. 2 nights later, it happened again, but this time with Mr. Garrison in room 411. He was a Gulf War veteran, admitted for PTSD and severe paranoia, the kind of patient who already slept with one eye open and would wedge chairs against his door despite our safety protocols. At exactly 3:15 a.m., he hit his call button repeatedly and was found crouched in his bathroom, refusing to come out because that nurse had been standing at the foot of his bed. When I responded to the call along with Tom, the mental health tech, Mr. Garrison looked at me and went completely pale. He kept saying, "That's her, that's the one who was in my room," over and over, his voice getting louder each time. The problem was, at 3:15 a.m., I was in the break room on the opposite side of the building, on a video call with my daughter who was studying in California. She'd been having anxiety about her midterms and needed to talk. I had the call log on my phone. Tom had seen me in there when he'd grabbed his lunch, and the security cameras in the hallway showed me never leaving that break room between 2:45 and 3:30 a.m. The charge nurse from Unit 4A, Janet, suggested maybe someone was playing a prank, possibly another staff member who looked similar to me. Though honestly, I'm 5'2" with prematurely gray hair and a distinctive scar on my chin from a childhood bike accident. Not exactly common features. We reviewed all the security footage from both nights, every single camera on the unit, and found nothing. No one entering those rooms except for the regular hourly rounds by the techs. The doors to 407 and 411 remained closed between rounds, and the hallway cameras showed no movement. Dr. Phelps, the attending psychiatrist, started adjusting medications, assuming we were dealing with some kind of shared delusion, maybe triggered by something environmental. We'd had issues with the ventilation system that winter, and sometimes poor air quality can cause strange symptoms. But the patients weren't displaying any other signs of confusion or hallucination, just this one specific claim about me being in their rooms at 3:15 a.m. By Friday of that week, 3 more patients had reported the same thing. Mrs. Truman in 403, a schoolteacher admitted for severe anxiety, woke up screaming that I'd been standing by her window. James, a 19-year-old in 409 dealing with his first psychotic break, became so agitated after seeing me in his room that he had to be physically restrained. And James actually liked me during the day, always asking about my kids and telling me about his plans to study engineering once he got better. The 5th patient was the one that really rattled me. Evelyn in 405, an elderly woman with dementia who rarely had lucid moments anymore. She'd been basically nonverbal for weeks, but at 3:15 a.m. she suddenly started crying and clearly said, "The nurse with the gray hair was here just standing and staring. Why won't she answer me?" The aide who was sitting with her nearly jumped out of her skin because Evelyn hadn't spoken a coherent sentence since admission. Administration got involved after that 5th incident. They installed additional cameras, brought in IT specialists to check for system glitches, even had maintenance inspect every inch of the unit for hidden passages or accessibility issues that someone could exploit. The tech team discovered something odd, but not particularly helpful. The call button system showed activation times at exactly 3:15 a.m. for each incident, down to the second, which seemed impossible unless someone was coordinating it with atomic clock precision. But here's what made everything worse. I started documenting where I was at 3:15 a.m. each night, making sure I had witnesses, keeping myself in well-surveilled areas. Saturday night, I stationed myself at the main nurses' station with 3 other staff members, all of us watching the clock. At 3:14, we were all joking nervously about it, with Tom saying maybe I had a twin sister I didn't know about. At 3:15 exactly, nothing happened. We all exhaled in relief. Then at 3:16, the call light for room 402 started its frantic beeping. Mr. Carver, a formerly successful accountant admitted for severe bipolar disorder, was hyperventilating when we reached him. He was pressed against his headboard, pointing at the spot near his closet where he said I'd been standing. But this time was different. He said I wasn't just staring. He said I was mouthing words, no sound coming out, just my lips moving over and over in what looked like the same pattern. When we asked him what it looked like I was saying, he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises and said, "You were saying not yet, not yet, not yet." I had 5 witnesses who knew I'd been at the nurses' station, including Dr. Phelps, who'd stopped by to review charts. The security footage confirmed I never left my seat, but Mr. Carver had scratches on his arms, self-inflicted, he said, to make sure he was really awake when he saw me there. He showed us the blood under his fingernails as proof that he hadn't been dreaming. Sunday night was my last shift before a scheduled 3-day break, and I almost called in sick. My daughter had asked if everything was okay during our calls, said I sounded different, distracted. The other nurses were giving me these looks, not suspicious exactly, but uncertain, like they were reassessing every interaction we'd ever had. Around 2:45 a.m., I made a decision. I took my phone and had Tom video record me continuously from 3:10 to 3:20 a.m. We sat in the medication room with its single entrance, no windows, just one door that would be visible in the recording. At 3:13, we heard footsteps in the hallway outside, the distinct squeak of nursing shoes on the polished floor. Tom looked at me, then at the door, then back at me. The footsteps stopped right outside. We waited, but no one knocked. No one entered. At exactly 3:15, Tom's walkie crackled to life with urgent calls from Unit 4B. 2 patients this time, rooms 401 and 408, both hysterical, both claiming I was in their rooms right at that moment. The video on Tom's phone showed me sitting perfectly still in that medication room, my face pale and my eyes wide, never moving from my chair. But here's what made Tom drop his phone. At the 3:15:07 mark in the recording, you can see me in the chair, but my reflection in the glass door behind me, it's not there. For exactly 43 seconds, the chair reflects, the room reflects, Tom's arm holding the phone reflects. But where I should be in that reflection, there's just empty space. Tom transferred to day shift after that night. The 2 patients from rooms 401 and 408 both described the same thing. I'd been standing at the foot of their beds, but this time my eyes were closed and I was swaying slightly, like someone sleeping on their feet. Mrs. Chen in 401 said she tried to call out to me but couldn't make any sound come out of her mouth. George in 408, a construction worker dealing with severe depression, said he could see his breath in the suddenly cold air when I appeared, even though the heating system showed normal temperatures for the entire unit. I took my 3 days off but couldn't stop thinking about what was happening. I researched everything I could: sleep disorders, electromagnetic fields, mass hysteria, even carbon monoxide poisoning that might cause hallucinations. Nothing fit the pattern. I called my ex-husband, who's a neurologist, and without giving too many details, asked if someone could be in 2 places at once, neurologically speaking. He laughed and said only in the minds of observers, that perception is subjective and memory is reconstructive. But then he got quiet and asked if I was okay, said I sounded exhausted. On my last day off, Wednesday afternoon, I got a call from Janet. There had been an incident on Tuesday night, not at 3:15 a.m. but at 3:15 p.m. during the day shift. A patient in Unit 4A, someone who'd never been on my unit, had started screaming about a gray-haired nurse standing by his window, describing me perfectly down to the small mole behind my left ear. I was at home, 40 miles away, on a video call with my mother that I could easily prove. When I returned Thursday night, administration pulled me into a meeting. They weren't accusing me of anything. The evidence clearly showed I was never in those rooms, but they suggested I take a longer leave of absence, said maybe the patients were picking up on some kind of stress I was projecting. They offered paid psychiatric leave, which felt like a slap in the face after 15 years of solid service. But that last night shift changed everything. I was packing up my locker, planning to take the leave they suggested, when Evelyn's aide found me. She was a young woman named Kendra, who usually worked with dementia patients because of her incredible patience. She told me that Evelyn had been mumbling all week, mostly incoherent, but she'd been writing things down when she had clearer moments. Kendra handed me a crumpled piece of paper covered in shaky handwriting. Most of it was illegible, but one line in the middle was perfectly clear. "The nurse isn't visiting, she's practicing." I took the leave of absence and never went back to Pinewood. The official report concluded it was a case of mass psychogenic illness, triggered by one patient's vivid hallucination that spread through suggestion to others, though that didn't explain the matching times, the specific details, or Evelyn's sudden lucidity. About 6 months later, I ran into Bryce at a grocery store. He told me the 3:15 incident stopped the day I left, just completely ceased. But he also told me something that made me go cold right there in the cereal aisle. They'd hired a travel nurse to cover my shifts temporarily, an older woman named Susan, who happened to have gray hair. 3 weeks into her assignment, she had what they called a cardiac event at exactly 3:15 a.m. while sitting at the nurse's station. She survived, but when she came to, she kept insisting someone had been standing behind her, someone who looked exactly like her but empty, like a photocopy of a photocopy. She quit nursing entirely after that. I work at a pediatric clinic now, day shifts only, and I've never had another incident. But sometimes I wake up at 3:15 a.m. for no reason, and I lie there wondering if somewhere, in some other hospital, another nurse is seeing themselves in places they've never been, practicing for something none of us understand. I work nights, and back when this happened, I was assigned as the only security guard covering the psychiatric wing of a mid-sized hospital. My routine was simple: rounds every hour, check the doors, then sit in the monitoring room flipping through the surveillance feeds. Most nights blurred together into silence and fluorescent hums, but I had gotten used to that calm. It's the kind of quiet that plays tricks on your head if you let it. What kept me grounded were the cameras. Watching them gave me the sense that at least I wasn't completely alone in that wing. The first time I noticed the gap was by accident. I was drinking burnt coffee from the break room and rewinding footage from earlier in the week, trying to stay awake. Right around 2:10 a.m., the screen blinked like static and then skipped ahead 10 minutes. At first I thought it was a glitch in the playback system. I checked the hard drive, ran diagnostics, everything. No warnings, no signs of corruption. It was like those minutes had been deliberately cut out. When I mentioned it casually to one of the nurses the next day, she gave me this nervous laugh and said, "That's probably when the ghosts come out." I brushed it off, but then she leaned closer and lowered her voice. Some of the patients had been talking about new staff, walking into their rooms at night. They described men in pale uniforms, neat but old-fashioned, like something out of the 70s. The problem was, no one on payroll matched those descriptions. And worse, patients said the staff never spoke. They just stood at the foot of the bed, staring, then left without a sound. That week, one of the long-term patients, a woman named Cynthia, stopped eating. She told her assigned nurse that one of those silent orderlies had come into her room during the blackout. She swore he touched her wrist and whispered something she couldn't understand. 5 days later, she was found unresponsive in her bed. No foul play, no cause anyone could explain. Just gone. And when I checked back on the footage for that night, sure enough, the gap was right there. 2:01 to 2:20 a.m. Nothing but black. After Cynthia's death, I stopped thinking of it as a glitch. I began checking the monitors live during those hours, watching for the blackout. The first Wednesday, I stayed glued to the chair, waiting. At exactly 2 a.m., the feed blinked out. Every single camera in the psychiatric wing going dark at once. Not frozen, just gone, like someone pulled the plug. I stared at the blank screens, counting the minutes. When the picture came back at 2:20, everything looked exactly the same. Patients sleeping, hallways empty. It was as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had moved in that space while I was blind. The staff whispered about it, but no one filed reports. It wasn't like they didn't notice. It was more like they didn't want the responsibility of admitting it. Nurses avoided talking about those 20 minutes, brushing it off as technical trouble. But the patients, they were different. Some woke up crying, others refused to sleep on Wednesdays altogether. I started keeping a notebook, not about the cameras, but about who complained afterward. And each time, without fail, one of those names was crossed out within a week. There was this one patient, Michael, a young guy with schizophrenia who actually trusted me. He said one of the orderlies stood at his door the whole time the cameras were out. He described the man's face in detail, sharp jawline, buzz cut, but eyes so pale they almost glowed under the dim lights. The uniform he wore didn't have the hospital's logo, but a small stitched patch shaped like a diamond. Michael asked me straight up if I'd seen the guy. I wanted to tell him no, but something in me hesitated. It was easier to say I'd look into it even though I had no way of confirming anything. The strangest part wasn't just the deaths, it was the silence surrounding them. Administrators wrote them off as natural declines or complications of mental illness. There were no investigations, no autopsies that explained anything unusual. Still, every time I sat in that chair, waiting for the feeds to vanish, I felt like I was complicit, watching a cycle no one wanted to stop. I knew another name would be gone soon. The question was just, who? One night I decided to break the routine. Instead of staying in the control room, I walked the wing right before 2 a.m. I left the monitors recording and carried a small flashlight, making sure my footsteps stayed quiet on the linoleum floors. As the clocks ticked over, every overhead light flickered and then hummed back to life, but the air felt heavier, almost charged. I ducked into the corner of a hallway and waited, staring down toward the patient rooms. For 20 minutes, I didn't hear a single sound, not the usual mutters or restless movements from inside the rooms, not even the distant mechanical buzz from the vents, just dead silence, so thick it pressed against my ears. When the feeds came back, I hurried into the control room to review what had been recorded. Strangely, the tapes showed nothing but static for those 20 minutes, as if the lens itself had been blinded. Yet my watch confirmed that the hallway lights had stayed on while I was there. It made no sense. What bothered me more was that when I returned to the wing the next morning, one of the orderlies, a real one, told me that a patient named Russell had been screaming all night, claiming 2 men in white tried to drag him out of bed. 4 days later, Russell died in his sleep. I finally took it to my supervisor, showing her the logs of the blackouts. She listened, but her response was careful, almost rehearsed. "Don't dig into this," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Trust me, let it go." The conversation ended there. No follow-up, no explanation. Just a warning that told me more than her words did. It was the first time I realized maybe the administration wasn't ignoring the problem. They knew. They just chose silence over answers. Not long after, I quit. Walked out one morning and never went back. I still don't understand what I saw or what I didn't see, but I know those 20 minutes are real. And somewhere in that wing, someone or something walks freely while the cameras go blind. Patients see them, staff pretends not to, and eventually a bed goes empty. To this day, every time a digital clock flicks past 2 a.m., I wonder who they're standing in front of now. My name's Dr. Alan Mercer, and during the year I worked at St. Clair Psychiatric Hospital, I carried myself as someone who believed he had a firm grasp on reality. My life was fairly structured: morning rounds, private sessions, late evenings reviewing patient notes in a cramped office with buzzing fluorescent lights. I thought of myself as calm, methodical, even gentle with the people under my care. That's what made it unbearable when they started describing interactions with me that didn't match anything I remembered. The first time it happened, one of my long-term patients, Claire, told me I spent an entire session glaring at her with what she called a predatory scowl. She said I leaned forward, scribbling furiously as she spoke, and then repeated back words she swore she hadn't said. According to her, I told her she was wasting my time and that her problems were trivial compared to real illnesses. Hearing that rattled me. I knew without hesitation that I hadn't said or done any of it. At first I assumed it was part of her condition, projection, confusion, maybe even testing my boundaries. But then the reports multiplied. Another patient claimed I had smirked while he cried about his brother's death. A third told the nurses that I never looked him in the eyes, only at the reflection in the one-way mirror. Each story painted me as someone cold, hostile, and condescending. I started to doubt whether I was remembering sessions correctly. Colleagues joined the chorus in subtle ways too. One resident, Dr. Emily Nash, mentioned during a case review that my body language had been harsh. She said I'd crossed my arms the entire session and nodded dismissively whenever the patient spoke. I was stunned, because in my memory I'd been leaning in, listening, speaking softly. But Emily insisted. And then she added something strange. The ward's security footage would probably clear things up, since cameras ran constantly in the therapy rooms. I asked to review the footage myself. Sitting in the small monitoring room with a guard named Lucas, I felt an odd mix of dread and anticipation. The grainy video loaded, and there I was, same office, same clothes, same patient sitting across from me. But the version of me on screen didn't match what I remembered. My shoulders were hunched forward, jaw clenched, and my eyes locked on Claire like I was dissecting her. Every few seconds I'd jot down something in the notepad. When she laughed nervously, the man on the screen tilted his head and sneered. I wanted to argue that it wasn't me, but the figure moved exactly as I did. The strangest part was the notes. I leaned closer, watching myself scribble entire sentences. Claire never said half of what was written. She'd been talking about a childhood memory, but the me on camera wrote, "She feels watched. She admits guilt. She lies constantly." None of that was true, at least not from the conversation I remembered. Yet the handwriting was mine. Same quick slant, same shorthand I'd used for years. Lucas looked uncomfortable. He didn't say anything, just crossed his arms and waited for me to explain. I couldn't. I muttered something about stress, about maybe mixing up sessions. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. My memory of that day was crystal clear, and it clashed violently with the evidence playing on the screen. Still, I tried to bury the doubt and told myself it was a one-off mistake. The next week shattered that illusion. More patients confronted me about things I supposedly said. Harsh comments, outright accusations, even sarcastic laughter. And every time I checked the footage, the recording backed them up. The man in the video looked like me, moved like me, wrote like me. But he wasn't me. It felt as if there were two versions of my life running parallel. The one I lived in my head, and the one the cameras and witnesses swore was real. I started to dread every session. Patients wouldn't even sit down before asking why I'd been so cold the last time, or why I'd written down words they'd never spoken. Nurses whispered that I seemed different in the hallways, though no one could define how. I became obsessed with proving to myself that I was still me. Some nights I'd lock my office door and stare at the mirror above my desk, forcing myself to smile, frown, blink, checking whether my own reflection would betray me. One night after hours, I gave in and pulled another video from the system, one I hadn't been authorized to watch. It was a session with a new patient named Marcus. The camera caught everything. Marcus nervously explaining his anxiety, me nodding. And then a shift. My face hardened, lips curling in something between contempt and amusement. I leaned toward him and muttered words I swear never left my mouth. "You don't deserve help. You're wasting this bed." Marcus flinched in the footage. In my memory, I had said something comforting, almost the opposite. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I wrote a formal resignation letter. I couldn't risk doing more harm, if harm was really what was happening. Before I left, I asked Lucas one last favor: to watch a live feed with me so I wouldn't be alone in seeing it. We chose an empty therapy room, turned the monitor on, and there I was, sitting in the chair. Only I wasn't in the room physically. The figure on the screen stared directly into the camera, expressionless before slowly raising a hand and writing something on a notepad. Neither of us could read the words, but we both knew the handwriting. I left St. Clair that day and never went back. To this day, I've never found another job in psychiatry, and I've stopped trying. Every so often, I dream of that therapy chair and the figure sitting there, staring back through the lens as if waiting for me to return. I don't know which version of me people saw or why the cameras sided with them, but I do know this: whatever was recorded in those rooms, it wasn't the man I remember being. And maybe that's the part that scares me most.